At dinner, my brother smirked. "You only bought that house because Mom and Dad helped you, so let me move in." Mom nodded. "He's right. You should help family." Dad added, "It's the least you can do." I put down my fork and said, "If that's how you all feel, don't expect me to keep helping you anymore." The table went silent when I pulled out. I, 32M, sat at the dinner table that evening, pushing roast chicken around my plate while my parents talked about the neighborhood. My brother sat across from me, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. I should have known something was coming. We were at Mom and Dad's place for our monthly family dinner, something I'd been attending religiously for years despite my increasingly packed schedule. The house smelled like it always did, vanilla candles and whatever Mom had been baking that afternoon. It should have felt comfortable. Instead, I felt my stomach tightening with each passing minute. My brother leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass with the casual arrogance he'd perfected over the years. He asked me how the new house was treating me. I told him it was good, that I was still settling in but enjoying the space. The house had been a milestone for me, a 4-bedroom property in a decent neighborhood that I'd saved for years to afford. That's when he dropped it. He said I only managed to buy that house because Mom and Dad had helped me with the down payment, so the least I could do was let him move in for a while. He was between jobs again, he explained, and his landlord was being unreasonable about late rent. The table went quiet for a moment. I looked at my parents, expecting them to shut this down. Instead, Mom nodded slowly and said he had a point. Family should help family, she added. Dad chimed in that it was the least I could do after everything they'd done for me. I put down my fork carefully, the metal clinking against the ceramic plate louder than it should have been. The thing was, they weren't entirely wrong about the help. 5 years ago, when I was 27 and scraping together every dollar I could, my parents had offered to loan me $15,000 for the down payment. I'd taken it gratefully and paid them back in full within 18 months, with interest they'd initially refused but eventually accepted. But my brother seemed to have forgotten, or more likely, never cared, about the part where I'd paid them back. He also conveniently overlooked the fact that he'd borrowed money from them at least 4 times in the past 3 years and hadn't returned a cent. I asked him how long he planned to stay. He shrugged and said he wasn't sure, maybe a few months until he got back on his feet. Maybe longer if things didn't work out. He said it like he was doing me a favor by even considering my house as an option. Something in me snapped. Not dramatically, not with raised voices or thrown napkins. Just a cold, clear realization that I was done playing this game. I told them that if that was how they all felt about my house and my success, they shouldn't expect me to keep helping them anymore. Mom asked me what I meant. Her tone suggested she thought I was being dramatic, throwing a tantrum over a reasonable family request. I laid it out plainly. I reminded them about the loan I'd repaid in full. Then I brought up the other ways I'd been helping, the property taxes I'd been paying on their house for the past 2 years when Dad's business hit a rough patch, the new roof I'd funded last summer, the car repairs I'd covered for Mom just 3 months ago. Dad's face changed. He started to say something about how family doesn't keep score, but I cut him off. I agreed that family doesn't keep score, which was exactly why I'd never mentioned any of it before. But if we were going to start treating my house like communal property because of a repaid loan from 5 years ago, then maybe we should look at the full picture. My brother's smirk had vanished. He tried to argue that his situation was different, that he'd hit some bad luck and just needed a temporary place to crash. I asked him what happened to the money he'd borrowed 18 months ago, the $3,000 that was supposed to help him start his online business. He mumbled something about unexpected expenses. I told them I wouldn't be lending any more money, paying any more bills, or opening my home to anyone who viewed my success as something I owed them rather than something I'd earned. Then I stood up, grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair, and walked out while they were still processing what I'd said. The drive home felt surreal. My phone started buzzing before I'd even made it to the highway. Mom called first, then Dad, then 3 text messages from my brother. I let them all go to voicemail. That night, I sat in my living room in my house, that I'd worked 60-hour weeks to afford, and felt something shift inside me. For years, I'd been the responsible one, the successful one, the one everyone turned to when they needed something. And I'd been happy to help because that's what family does. But somewhere along the way, help had turned into expectation, and expectation had turned into entitlement. Update 1. 3 days passed before I listened to the voicemails. Mom's first message was apologetic but cautious. She said they'd been surprised by my reaction and maybe they'd pushed too hard. She asked me to call her back so we could talk about it reasonably. Dad's message was shorter, stiffer. He said I'd embarrassed them by walking out like that, and we needed to have a conversation about my attitude toward family obligations. My brother's texts were a mix of anger and manipulation. The first one called me selfish. The second one reminded me of all the times he'd been there for me growing up, conveniently rewriting history to paint himself as some kind of protective older brother instead of the guy who'd borrowed my car without asking and returned it with an empty tank. The third message said I was letting money change who I was. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I spent the weekend reviewing my finances and making a list. It was longer than I'd realized. Over the past 5 years, I'd given or loaned my family over $43,000. My parents had repaid none of the money I'd used for their house expenses because we'd had an unspoken agreement that I was helping out, not creating debt. My brother had borrowed and never returned roughly $8,000 across various requests. The roof alone had cost me $12,000. The property taxes were $4,000 annually. Then there were the smaller things. The phone bill I'd taken over when Dad said his business couldn't handle it, the insurance payments, the groceries I'd regularly brought over, the dinner bills I'd always picked up. Monday morning, I got a call from Mom asking if I was coming to dinner that weekend. Her voice carried that edge of forced normalcy. Like if we all just pretended the previous dinner hadn't happened, everything would reset to the comfortable pattern. I told her I needed some space and wouldn't be coming for a while. She pressed me on what a while meant. I said I didn't know yet. Then she pivoted to my brother, explaining that he was really struggling and my refusal to help had put them in a difficult position. Apparently, my brother had told them he'd been counting on moving into my place and had already given notice to his landlord. That was manipulative even by his standards, creating an artificial crisis to force my hand. I asked Mom why he'd given notice before even asking me properly. She went quiet, then admitted she'd told him I'd probably say yes if he asked at a family dinner where refusing would be uncomfortable. The honesty was almost refreshing. I told her that was exactly the problem. She'd tried to manipulate me into making a decision I clearly hadn't wanted to make, and when it backfired, she was upset at me for not playing along. She started to argue, but I ended the call. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into the projects I'd been half-handling while juggling family obligations. Without the constant drain of family dinners, emergency phone calls about money, and weekend trips to help with various house projects, I suddenly had time and energy I'd forgotten I could possess. 2 weeks after the dinner, Dad showed up at my house unannounced. I saw his car pull into the driveway through my front window and considered not answering the door. But I let him in, and we stood awkwardly in my entryway while he looked around at the place he'd only visited twice since I'd moved in 8 months ago. He said we needed to talk about what happened. I agreed and asked if he wanted coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd been eating breakfast alone for the past 2 weeks, actually enjoying my mornings for the first time in years. Dad told me he understood I was upset, but that I was taking things too far. Family relationships required compromise and forgiveness. He said Mom was hurt by my distance, and my brother was in a genuinely bad spot. He asked me to reconsider, to be the bigger person. I asked him if he remembered the conversation we'd had 3 years ago when his business was failing. He looked confused, so I reminded him. He'd come to me panicking about losing the house, about not knowing how he'd pay the property taxes. I told him not to worry, that I'd handle it, and I'd been handling it ever since. I asked him if he remembered promising that it was temporary, just until he got back on his feet. He nodded slowly. I told him his business had been profitable again for over a year, according to what he'd told me at Christmas, but he'd never brought up resuming the tax payments. He claimed he hadn't realized I expected him to, that he thought I'd been giving them as a gift. That was the heart of it. Somewhere in all my helping, the line between supporting family and being taken advantage of had blurred completely. In their minds, my money was family money, available whenever needed without expectation of return or even acknowledgement. I told Dad I wasn't going to be that person anymore. I wasn't cutting them off completely, but I was done being the family bank and the family safety net. He asked what that meant practically. I said it meant if they needed help, they could ask clearly and directly, and I'd decide on a case-by-case basis. It meant no more assumed support, no more manipulation at dinner tables, and definitely no more letting my brother move in because they'd orchestrated an ambush. Dad left looking older than when he'd arrived. I felt guilty for about an hour, then remembered the smirk on my brother's face and the way Mom had nodded in support of his entitlement. The guilt faded. Update 2. A month passed. My brother moved in with my parents, which I learned through a mutual cousin rather than from my family directly. Apparently, his landlord situation had been resolved with money from Mom and Dad, who'd taken out a small loan to cover it. The cousin mentioned it casually, adding that my parents seemed stressed about finances lately. That information bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Part of me wanted to swoop in and fix it like I always had. Part of me recognized that was exactly the pattern I needed to break. They'd made a choice to support my brother instead of enforcing boundaries with him. That was their decision to make, and they'd have to live with the consequences. I got a long email from Mom 6 weeks after the dinner. It was more honest than any conversation we'd had in years. She admitted they'd gotten used to relying on me and had stopped seeing it as relying on me. She said Dad was too proud to admit he'd made mistakes in how they'd treated me. She apologized for the ambush at dinner and said she understood why I was angry. But then she asked if I was really going to let pride destroy our family relationships. She said my brother was struggling with depression and my coldness wasn't helping. She reminded me that parents make mistakes, but that doesn't mean children should abandon them. The email sat in my inbox for 3 days before I responded. I told her I hadn't abandoned anyone. I'd simply stopped allowing them to take advantage of me. I explained that healthy family relationships couldn't be built on one person constantly giving while others constantly took. I said I loved them, but I needed to see actual change, not just apologies that came with new requests hidden inside them. She didn't respond to that email. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Dad's business partner. We'd met a few times at company events, and he'd always struck me as straightforward. He asked if we could meet for coffee, said it was about my father, but wasn't an emergency. We met at a place downtown, neutral territory. He told me Dad had been making poor business decisions lately, seemed distracted and stressed. The business partner was worried and wondered if something was going on at home that he should know about. He knew Dad and I were close, or had been, and thought I might have insight. I told him the basics, that we'd had a family disagreement about boundaries and money. I didn't go into details, but I said Dad might be under financial stress. The business partner nodded slowly and admitted he'd suspected something like that. He asked if I thought Dad would accept help if it was offered through the business rather than personally. It was a lifeline I hadn't expected. I told him Dad probably would, that his pride was part of the problem. The business partner said he'd think about how to approach it. I thanked him for caring enough to reach out. That conversation stuck with me. My father had a good friend looking out for him, someone who'd noticed he was struggling and wanted to help. It made me wonder if my parents had any other support systems, or if they'd become so dependent on me that they'd isolated themselves from other people who might have helped. 3 months after the dinner, my brother showed up at my office. Security called up to ask if I'd see him, and I almost said no. But curiosity got the better of me. He looked different, thinner, tired, less cocky than I'd seen him in years. He asked if we could talk somewhere private. I took him to a conference room, and we sat across from each other at a large table that suddenly felt ridiculous for a conversation between brothers. He told me he'd started seeing a therapist, that Mom had insisted on it as a condition of living with them. The therapist had helped him realize some things about his patterns of behavior. He apologized for what he'd said at dinner and for how he'd treated me over the years. He said he'd been jealous of my success and had justified his requests for money by telling himself I owed the family because I'd succeeded where he'd failed. He acknowledged it wasn't fair or healthy. I asked him what he wanted from this conversation. He said nothing, that he was apologizing because his therapist said he needed to make amends, and I was at the top of his list. He didn't expect me to forgive him or give him another chance. He just wanted me to know he was working on himself. It was the most genuine conversation we'd had in years. I told him I appreciated the apology and was glad he was getting help. I didn't offer forgiveness or reconciliation, but I didn't slam the door completely shut either. He seemed to accept that, and he left without pressing for more. That night, I thought about what healthy family relationships might actually look like. Not the forced closeness I'd been maintaining through financial support, but something real built on mutual respect and clear boundaries. It seemed simultaneously impossible and necessary. Update 3. 6 months after the dinner that changed everything, I invited my parents to my house. Not for dinner, just for coffee and a conversation. They arrived together, both of them looking nervous and uncertain in a way that would have been unthinkable a year ago. We sat in my living room, and I told them I'd been doing a lot of thinking about family and what it meant to support each other. I said I wanted to rebuild our relationship, but it needed to be different from before. I needed them to see me as a person, not as a resource. I needed them to respect my boundaries and my decisions. Mom cried a little and said they'd been awful to me. Dad cleared his throat several times before admitting they'd taken advantage of my success and generosity. He said the past few months had been hard but educational. They'd had to manage their own problems without falling back on me, and it had forced them to make better decisions. I asked about the business, and Dad said his partner had helped him restructure some things, and it was improving. I asked about my brother, and Mom said he was still in therapy and had gotten a job at a warehouse. It wasn't glamorous, but he was showing up consistently and seemed more stable than he'd been in years. Then we talked about what moving forward might look like. I told them I'd be willing to help in genuine emergencies, but I needed clear requests with clear expectations. No more assumed support, no more permanent solutions to temporary problems, and absolutely no more ambushing me at family dinners. They agreed, though I could see it was hard for them to accept the new dynamic. We'd gone from them being the parents I tried to please to something more equal, more honest. It was uncomfortable for all of us, but it felt necessary. We didn't fix everything that afternoon, but we started talking in a way we hadn't in years, actually communicating instead of dancing around expectations and resentments. Mom asked if I'd be willing to come to dinner again sometime. I said maybe in a few months, after we'd rebuilt some trust. They left after an hour, and I felt lighter than I had in months. The house was still mine, my success was still my own, and my family was slowly becoming people I chose to have in my life rather than obligations I couldn't escape. My brother and I had lunch 2 weeks after that. He'd asked through a text message, giving me an easy out if I wanted it, but I agreed. We met at a casual place, and the conversation was stilted at first. But he told me about his job, about what he was learning in therapy, about his plans to eventually move into his own place again. I told him about work, about the projects I was doing well now that I had the mental space for them. We didn't discuss the past much. We just sat together as two adults who happened to be brothers, trying to figure out what that could mean going forward. It wasn't the warm family reconciliation that movies promise. It was messier than that, more uncertain. But it was real in a way our previous relationship never had been. We weren't held together by guilt and obligation and unspoken debts. We were choosing to be in each other's lives, carefully and with clear boundaries. Walking back to my car after that lunch, I thought about the dinner table 6 months ago and how walking out had felt like burning everything down. But sometimes you have to destroy something broken before you can build something better. The family I had now was smaller, more careful, less comfortable, but it was built on something real instead of on my exhaustion and their expectations. The house I'd worked so hard for was still mine. The life I'd built was still mine, and my family, in whatever form it took going forward, would have to respect that. It wasn't the ending I'd expected when I put down my fork that evening, but it was the one I needed.